In 1924, the Soviet Union was a newly established state under communist rule, made up of 6 republics and a central armed force. Its symbols, the hammer and sickle, the plow, the sheaf of corn, the cogwheel, the red flag, and the book of laws, represented industry, agriculture, governance, and ideology. The USSR emphasized state control of the economy, collective ownership of land, and the creation of a classless society. While art and propaganda highlighted unity and progress, the nation was still recovering from revolution, civil war, and international isolation, setting the stage for the major transformations and challenges of the coming decades. Communism is based on the ideas of Karl Marx, a 19th century thinker. He believed all history was a struggle between two classes, the haves, capitalists, who owned money and means of production such as factories, mines, and railways, and the have-nots, the working class, or proletariat. Marx argued that capitalists exploited workers by paying low wages and keeping profits, making the rich richer and the poor poorer. He predicted that workers would eventually revolt, seize the means of production, and establish a new system. This would begin with the dictatorship of the proletariat, where workers' leaders crushed opposition and controlled land, factories, and banks, sharing profits among the people. This stage was called socialism. Under socialism, the means of production would be owned by the people, ensuring better housing, healthcare, education, and social benefits. When everyone had learned to work for the common good, strict government would no longer be needed, and society would evolve into Marx's ideal system, communism. In the USSR, communists took control of the government during the October 1917 revolution. Led by V.I. Lenin, they set up a dictatorship of the proletariat, banned all non-communists, and turned the country into a one-party state. After 1921, Lenin also banned groups within the Communist Party that criticized his rule. About 750,000 people were expelled, or purged, from the party that year. The country seized in 1917 had been known as Russia for centuries. In 1923, however, a new constitution created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR. There were 6 republics in the Union, each with its own government to manage health, education, and justice. For national matters, such as defense, the republics had commissars, or ministers, who acted on the instructions of the national government in Moscow, the capital of the USSR. On paper, the 1923 constitution granted Soviet citizens the right to vote. In reality, the Communist Party made certain that only its candidates could ever hold power. The structure was carefully designed. In every village, town, and city, citizens elected local councils known as Soviets. These councils elected larger regional Soviets, which in turn elected the Congress of Soviets, the official national parliament. From this Congress, a central committee was chosen, and from that committee emerged a small executive body called the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom, which functioned as the government of the USSR. The Soviet election system was only part of the government. For each Soviet, whether in a town, village, region, or republic, there was a parallel Communist Party group. At every level, party officials were also members of the Soviets. In this way, the Communist Party controlled both national and local government throughout the USSR. After the 1917 revolution, the Soviet Union faced 3 years of brutal civil war. To secure victory, Lenin introduced war communism. Peasants had their grain seized without payment, factories were nationalized, and workers were placed under military discipline, even facing execution for striking. Though it helped the communists win, the policy devastated Russia. By 1921, famine swept the land, killing around 7.5 million people. Rebellions erupted in the Navy and in Tambov province, forcing Lenin to abandon war communism. In its place, he launched the new economic policy. This policy allowed peasants to sell surplus grain, eased state control over factories, and permitted small-scale private business. By Lenin's death in 1924, the NEP had already begun to revive the shattered Soviet economy. By 1924, communist rule in the USSR was reshaping daily life. Workers had an 8-hour day, paid holidays, and social insurance benefits, yet unemployment was rising, with 1.24 million out of 8.5 million industrial workers without jobs. Marriage and divorce were simplified by the 1918 laws, and free love and abortion were permitted. Religion was suppressed, religious teaching was banned, clergy persecuted, and the League of Militant Atheists worked to weaken the church. Schools focused on sciences, discarding useless subjects, but thousands of war and famine orphans formed gangs, causing crime. Lenin died in January 1924, leaving the Politburo to choose his successor. The seven-member body was split. The rightists, led by Bukharin, supported continuing the new economic policy NEP to gradually enrich peasants and townspeople. The left opposition, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, wanted rapid industrialization, forced peasant production, and shock brigades to modernize industry. Personality clashes further divided the Politburo. Trotsky was brilliant but arrogant and unpopular among colleagues, while Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev allied to block him. Lenin's testament, written before his death, warned that Stalin held unlimited authority and criticized his rudeness and lack of caution, suggesting he be removed from his post. Stalin, however, had gained power as general secretary, controlling appointments, party membership, and organizational matters. Upon Lenin's death on January 21, 1924, Stalin led the mourning, gave speeches professing loyalty to Lenin's ideas, and had Lenin's body embalmed in Red Square. Trotsky, ill and misled about the funeral date, was sidelined, giving Stalin a strong chance to become the new leader despite Lenin's warnings. After Lenin died in 1924, two members of the Politburo appeared as likely successors, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Of the two, Stalin seemed most likely to succeed. Born in 1881 in Deadliest, Georgia, Stalin came from a peasant family. Early records describe him as of medium height, swarthy face, smallpox-scarred, with a strong Georgian accent, ordinary appearance, and seemingly modest intellectual ability. He was banished to eastern Siberia in 1904 for state crimes. Despite his unremarkable appearance, Stalin impressed contemporaries with his mastery of Marxism, determination, and unshakable resolve. Young, politically inexperienced party members regarded him as formidable, earning the reputation of a second Lenin in Transcaucasia. In May 1924, Lenin's testament, critical of Stalin's unlimited authority and rudeness, was read to the Central Committee, leaving Stalin's position vulnerable. However, Zinoviev defended Stalin, claiming Lenin's fears were groundless and emphasizing Stalin's harmonious cooperation with himself and Kamenev. As a result, Stalin remained general secretary, and the testament was not published, leaving most Russians unaware of Lenin's true opinions. Throughout 1924 to 1925, the Politburo debated the USSR's economic future. The central conflict was between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky promoted the theory of permanent revolution, believing that communism could survive only if it spread to Western Europe and colonies, using revolutionary support abroad. Stalin opposed this with socialism in one country, arguing that the USSR itself must come first, focusing on strengthening its economy before engaging abroad. Trotsky's ideas were unpopular, and in 1925, he resigned as Commissar for War. Stalin allied with the rightists, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, not out of agreement with NEP, but to remove Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev from the Politburo. By 1927, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the party. In 1928 to 1929, Stalin turned against the rightists, ending the NEP and pushing rapid industrialization. Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky resigned in 1929, and Trotsky was exiled from the USSR, eventually assassinated in Mexico in 1940 by an NKVD agent. Peasants, making up 100 million of the USSR's population, were crucial for financing industrialization. Most were poor, with tiny farms and traditional farming methods, limiting agricultural productivity. NEP had increased food production but failed to supply cities sufficiently. To solve this, in 1929, Stalin introduced collectivization, merging individual farms into kolkhozes of 50 to 100 families over 450 hectares, with tractors supplied by machine tractor stations. Peasants sold grain at fixed prices to the government and received wages. The richest peasants, kulaks, resisted. Numbering around 5 million families, they owned larger farms and hired laborers. Stalin declared in December 1929 the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Kulaks were categorized: actively hostile, deported to Siberia by the Okpu; wealthiest households, deported to other regions; least harmful, allowed to stay but given poor land. Property of the first two groups was confiscated and redistributed to collective farms. This marked the start of a massive, often violent, transformation of Soviet agriculture under Stalin. About 300,000 kulak families were deported from their homes, that is, roughly 1.5 million people. No proper arrangements were made for them in the areas to which they were sent, and they often had to fight for survival. Probably a quarter of them died of starvation, disease, ill treatment, and the cold. By February 1930, over half of the USSR's peasants had joined collective farms, but resistance was widespread. Many peasants destroyed crops, animals, tools, and buildings, causing a sharp drop in food production. As a result, the famine Stalin had feared occurred anyway, killing 5 to 6 million people between 1930 and 1933. British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge reported widespread starvation, with civilians unable to buy food while soldiers remained well-fed. To organize the economy, the USSR established Vdenka in 1917 and Gosplan in 1921 to plan production and development. By 1927, Gosplan drafted the first five-year plan, aiming to transform the USSR from an agrarian to an industrial country capable of producing all necessary equipment. The plan covered every sector: industry, agriculture, transport, energy, trade, housing, education, and public services, with government-mandated output targets, creating a command economy. Stalin's motivation for rapid industrialization arose from two perceived threats: a 1927 war scare from China and Britain, and claims that Western capitalists were sabotaging Soviet industry. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, Poland, Finland, Iran, and Romania, he argued that industrial strength was essential for defense. In a 1928 speech, Stalin declared that the USSR must overtake other countries technically and economically or face destruction. The first five-year plan began on October 1, 1928. Heavy industry, coal, iron, steel, oil, and machinery, was expected to triple output, the light industry double, and electrical energy production increased sixfold. Workers who failed to meet targets faced severe punishment. By 1929, Stalin accelerated the plan, demanding completion in 4 years instead of 5, warning that failure to increase speed would leave the USSR vulnerable to foreign threats. As soon as the first five-year plan ended, the USSR launched the second five-year plan for 1932 to 1937. To ensure targets were met, the government introduced strict work practices. In 1929, factories adopted an uninterrupted week, working all 7 days with only a fraction of workers off each day. This disrupted family life, church attendance, and led to harsh punishments for absenteeism, including dismissal and eviction. By 1932, internal passports were introduced, preventing workers from moving towns freely, and workbooks tracked job history and labor discipline. Many workers resisted these changes, as reflected in a 1929 secret police report from Smolensk, where weavers complained about overcrowded shifts, empty shops, and harsh management. Yet, some workers embraced the system through shock brigades, competing to increase output. Hard-working workers earned higher pay, better housing, and privileges, while the most exemplary became Stakhanovites. The Stakhanov movement began in 1935 when miner Alexei Stakhanov dramatically increased coal output by working efficiently with his comrades. His methods were publicized and imitated across industries, producing remarkable results, such as massive increases in coal, shoes, and machinery production. Stakhanovites received medals, flats, and national recognition, but sometimes faced hostility from other workers, leading the government to quietly phase out the movement by the late 1930s. The first five-year plan had doubled the industrial workforce from 11.3 million to 22.8 million, mostly former peasants unaccustomed to factory life. Towns became overcrowded, trams and buses packed, and families shared single rooms. In new industrial cities like Magnitogorsk, factories were built before housing, forcing workers into tents and huts. Despite harsh conditions, Soviet workers had guaranteed employment, unlike in capitalist countries during the 1930s, where unemployment reached millions. Many five-year plan projects were so ambitious that prison labor was used. In 1930, the Gulag, the chief administration of camps, was established to manage forced labor. Its first major project was the Belumir Canal, a 500-kilometer route from the White Sea to the Baltic Sea. Nearly 300,000 prisoners, or zeks, dug the canal by hand with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. Completed in just 20 months in May 1933, 72,000 zeks were released, while 228,000 were sent to other construction projects. Despite its purpose for the Soviet Navy, the canal proved too shallow and was scarcely used, even after being bombed in World War II. By the end of the 1930s, labor camps existed across the USSR. Surrounded by watchtowers and barbed wire, they were in remote regions as well as towns, fully visible to the public. The number of prisoners, or zeks, grew from 30,000 at the start of the first five-year plan to 2 million in 1932, 6 million by 1937, and 8 million by 1938. Conditions were harsh in all camps. Zeks worked hard under a rationing system, where food depended on the amount of work completed. As former prisoner Ernst Taldrin described in 1948, first cauldron, for those failing the norm, thin soup twice a day, 400 grams of bread. 2nd cauldron, full norm achieved, thin soup twice, 700 grams bread, buckwheat in the evening. 3rd cauldron, 15 to 20% above norm, soup, 900 grams bread, buckwheat, small meat or fish portion. 4th cauldron, governing staff, 750 grams bread, 2 meals with meat or fats. 5th cauldron, sick food, 3 meals, 700 grams bread. Prisoners ate before leaving for work and after returning, but usually received no food during 12-hour shifts. Another ex-prisoner noted in 1952 that the system trapped prisoners in a vicious circle. Hunger reduced productivity, poor productivity worsened hunger, with no escape. The Kalama camps in the northeast were among the harshest. Winters brought polar nights, temperatures as low as -60 degrees Celsius, and permanent permafrost. Beneath the frozen ground were vast gold and platinum deposits. A special Gulag unit, Dalstroy, organized gold mining from 1931. Prisoners arrived by ocean-going ships carrying up to 12,000 at a time. Work was manual, thawing frozen ground with bonfires, digging, and sifting for gold. Despite the harsh conditions, Kalama produced 300 tons of gold annually, half of the world's output. Many thousands of prisoners died. Ex-prisoner Alexander Solzhenitsyn recalled seeing frozen corpses piled around tents at Oratukan camp in 1937-38. High death rates were common across all camps. By 1938, around 20% of Zeks died annually. Those serving sentences over 5 years had little chance of survival. Between 1936 and 1950, roughly 12 million Zeks died in the labor camps. The Great Purge, show trials, and terror explain why so many people ended up in the Gulag. Some were kulaks removed from their land, others were workers failing 5-year plan targets, and some were ordinary criminals. However, the largest group was those arrested during the Great Purge of 1935 to 1938, which began after the mysterious murder of Sergei Kirov. On December 1, 1934, Sergei Kirov, a member of the Politburo and head of the Leningrad Communist Party, was shot in the back by Leonid Nikolaev, a young communist who had waited for him outside his office. The case contains strange mysteries. Days before, guards had stopped Nikolaev near Kirov's office, armed with a revolver and Kirov's schedule. Instead of arresting him, they returned his gun and released him. Even more suspicious was Kirov's bodyguard, Borisov. He was absent during the murder, and the very next day, he died in a mysterious car crash, the only casualty in the vehicle. That same evening, Stalin issued an order: anyone accused of terrorism was to be investigated immediately, tried without appeal, and executed after conviction. Nikolaev himself was tried in secret and executed on December 29, 1934. Many historians believe the NKVD, acting on Stalin's orders, deliberately allowed the assassination. Why? Kirov was moderate, popular, Russian-born, and a gifted speaker. At the 17th Party Congress, he received as much applause as Stalin himself. In short, Kirov was a potential rival for leadership. Stalin, however, declared the murder was part of a conspiracy against him and the party, claiming Nikolaev acted on orders from a Leningrad opposition center linked to Trotsky in exile. As a result, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others were arrested, imprisoned, and soon the NKVD widened its net. This marked the beginning of the Great Purge. The Communist Party began expelling unreliable members. Branches across the USSR were told to check whether members had ever supported Trotsky. At meetings, people denounced one another as Trotskyites, Zinovievites, or counter-revolutionaries. Written denunciations were also encouraged. One report to the NKVD in 1936 accused a kolkhoz worker, Afansia Yeromova, of hiding a portrait of Trotsky, calling her corrupt and subversive, and requesting her trial. Denounced party members were expelled, lost their jobs, and soon faced arrest by the NKVD. Friends and neighbors avoided them, fearing guilt by association. The most prominent victims faced public show trials. The trial of the 16, 1936, included Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others accused of plotting with Trotsky. All but one confessed and were shot the next day. The trial of the 17, 1937 charged party members with sabotage and terrorism. 13 were executed. The trial of the 21, 1938 targeted Bukharin, Rykov, and others. They confessed to working with spies and plotting against the state. All were found guilty and shot. The confessions often sounded absurd. In the 1938 trial, Sharangovich, first Secretary of Byelorussia, confessed to deliberately spreading plague among pigs in 1932 and causing anemia in horses in 1936, supposedly to weaken Soviet defenses. Why confess to such nonsense? Some prisoners hoped to save their lives if they cooperated. Others confessed under torture. Some, astonishingly, did so out of loyalty to the party, believing their sacrifice served communism. By 1937, the purge moved beyond the Communist Party and into the Red Army. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the USSR's most famous general, and several other top commanders were arrested and executed, accused of spying for Germany and Japan. By 1939, every admiral, 3 of the 5 army marshals, and nearly half of all officers had been shot. The terror spread to ordinary citizens. A careless remark about Stalin could lead to denunciation. Neighbors settled old grudges by reporting one another. Children were encouraged to betray parents, workers denounced their bosses, and some were arrested simply for failing to denounce others. By 1938, life in the Soviet Union was dominated by fear. Nobody knew whom they could trust. Everywhere, Stalin's presence was inescapable. His portrait hung on walls, billboards, and even entire buildings. Busts of Lenin and Stalin filled red corners in homes and offices. Towns, rivers, factories, and even schools were named after him. The press showered him with titles: Man of Steel, Iron Soldier, Universal Genius, Shining Son of Humanity. At public meetings, audiences applauded every mention of his name. Films, plays, novels, and poems celebrated every aspect of his life. Some even claimed Stalin could improve one's love life. At the 1935 Congress of Soviets, one delegate declared, "All thanks to thee, great educator Stalin. I love with a renewed love. My child's first word shall be, Stalin." While the cult of Stalin grew, religion was suppressed. Almost 40,000 churches and 25,000 mosques were closed or repurposed as cinemas, schools, or warehouses. Church bells were melted for scrap. Pilgrimages to Mecca were banned. Priests and imams were arrested. Those who escaped imprisonment were forbidden from leading worship. The League of Militant Atheists, founded in 1924, spread anti-religious propaganda. By 1933, it had 5.5 million members. They burned icons, converted cathedrals into museums, and mocked faith in classrooms. Their training manuals insisted, all religions rely on superstition. Communism does not. Marx called Christianity the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Schools under Stalin became strict and disciplined. The 1935 education law restored uniforms, compulsory pigtails for girls, and the return of report cards and exams. History was rewritten to glorify Russia's past and Stalin's role. Every child learned rule number 1. It is the duty of each school child to acquire knowledge persistently, to serve his country. The result was a dramatic fall in illiteracy. By 1939, 94% in towns and 86% in villages could read and write. Artists, writers, and composers worked under strict state control. Literature and art had to follow the doctrine of socialist realism, depicting ordinary workers and the triumph of communism. Books by disgraced leaders or unreliable authors vanished. Soviet writer Nadezhda Mandelstam later recalled how children pasted over portraits of fallen party figures in textbooks. Families burned forbidden books in their stoves. In new apartments, where stoves were absent, diaries and band works were cut up and flushed down toilets. In Stalin's USSR, art, education, and even private life existed only under the shadow of censorship and fear. In the 1920s, Soviet leaders tried to weaken the traditional family, which they saw as a tool of women's oppression. Wedding rings were banned. Marriages were reduced to brief civil ceremonies. Divorce required only one partner's request, and abortion was legal on demand. By the mid-1930s, Moscow saw more abortions than live births, and divorce rates were soaring. But in 1936, Stalin reversed course. A new family law made divorce harder, outlawed abortion except for medical reasons, and even restored wedding rings. Families with many children received tax breaks, and new benefits followed: free healthcare, paid holidays, and workplace insurance. Still, most families lived in cramped, shared apartments. Consumer goods, clothes, furniture, appliances, were scarce. The 5-year plans built factories and steel plants, not homes or shops. All of this was shaped by Stalin's overriding obsession, the threat from the capitalist West. He believed the USSR would one day be attacked, and he was determined to prepare. He industrialized the nation, collectivized its farms, purged its party and army, and created a climate of fear. Supporters argue it was necessary. When Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union endured 4 years of brutal war, losing 20 million people. Without Stalin's industrial drive, they say, the USSR could never have resisted Hitler's armies. But opponents disagree. They argue Stalin's methods were unnecessarily brutal. Industrialization, they claim, could have been achieved without mass executions, forced famines, and the Great Terror. The Red Army, they point out, was weakened by purges at the very moment it was needed most. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Western powers cut off ties with Russia. They were furious at the communists for pulling out of World War I, and several sent troops to fight them in the Civil War. Russia was excluded from the Paris Peace Treaties and the League of Nations. At first, Lenin welcomed this isolation. He expected world revolution to sweep away the capitalist states. To help spark it, Moscow set up the Comintern, an organization that funded strikes and uprisings abroad. But the revolutions failed. By the early 1920s, the Soviet Union needed trade and foreign technology. In 1922, the Treaty of Rapallo with Germany restored relations and allowed secret military cooperation. By 1929, the USSR had ties with most major powers, except the United States. Still, Stalin remained deeply suspicious. He believed the capitalist nations would one day unite against him, and that only rapid industrialization could save the USSR. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. He was fiercely anti-communist, considered Russians an inferior race, and openly called for German living space in Soviet territory. Stalin responded by entering world affairs. The USSR joined the League of Nations in 1934 and signed a mutual assistance pact with France the following year. He even ordered communist parties across Europe to cooperate with socialists against fascism. But Britain and France distrusted Moscow. Again and again, they appeased Hitler. They did nothing when he rearmed, nothing when he marched into Austria, and nothing when he seized Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland in 1938. The Soviets weren't even invited to the Munich conference, where that betrayal was sealed. By 1939, Stalin was convinced. Hitler would strike Poland next. And after Poland, it would be the turn of the Soviet Union. Stalin believed the USSR would lose a war against Germany, so he sought an ally. In April 1939, he asked Britain and France for a mutual assistance treaty, but they distrusted him and doubted the Red Army's strength. Stalin then turned to Hitler. On August 23, 1939, the two signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, agreeing not to fight each other. Secretly, they also agreed to divide Poland and allowed the USSR to reclaim Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and part of Finland. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. The USSR invaded on 17 September. They divided the country. To secure Leningrad, Stalin forced Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to allow Soviet bases, and in July 1940, he annexed them. Finland also posed a threat. When Finland rejected a land exchange offer, the Red Army invaded. The Finns fought well, but by March 1940, they surrendered and signed the Treaty of Moscow, ceding territory near Leningrad. The Winter War cost the USSR 200,000 soldiers, expelled it from the League of Nations, and revealed Red Army weaknesses, making Hitler doubt Soviet strength. In June 1940, while Germany conquered France, Stalin seized Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania, angering Hitler. By December 1940, Hitler abandoned plans to invade Britain and ordered preparations to attack the USSR in 1941. Stalin also feared Japan, which had invaded Manchuria in 1931, bringing Japanese and Soviet troops face to face. After Japan and Germany signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, Stalin feared a two-front war. To avoid this, he signed a neutrality pact with Japan in April 1941. This came just in time. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa began at 4:15 a.m., June 22, 1941. Three German armies with 3.2 million men broke through Soviet defenses, destroyed supplies, smashed the Red Air Force, and captured 600,000 Soviets within a week. Facing defeat, Stalin told the people on 3 July to adopt scorched earth tactics, evacuate trains, cattle, and grain, destroy anything left behind, and organize sabotage. Despite hatred of Stalin, the Soviets obeyed out of patriotism and because German cruelty was worse. Millions were enslaved or executed, especially Jews and communists. At Babi Yar near Kyiv, 100,000 Jews were massacred. By November 1941, Germany controlled all land west of Moscow. The USSR seemed doomed. Gosplan later noted that occupied areas had 40% of the population, 65% of coal, 68% of pig iron, 58% of steel, 60% of aluminum, 38% of grain, and 41% of railways. At the outbreak of World War II, Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 with Hitler, agreeing not to fight each other and secretly dividing Poland and the Baltic states. The USSR soon occupied eastern Poland, the Baltic countries, and parts of Romania. In the Winter War 1939-40, the Red Army fought Finland, eventually forcing territorial concessions but at the cost of 200,000 Soviet lives and international embarrassment. In June 1941, Hitler broke the pact with Operation Barbarossa, launching a massive invasion of the USSR. The Soviets, suffering huge early losses, adopted a scorched earth policy and fought desperately. German brutality, especially mass executions and deportations, turned many Soviet citizens into fierce defenders of their homeland. By late 1941, the USSR was saved by three factors: industry relocation east of the Urals, keeping war production alive; the Russian winter which crippled the Germans; U.S. Lend-Lease aid, which supplied vital food, weapons, and equipment. The war then turned with the Siege of Leningrad 1941-44, where 900,000 died, and the decisive Battle of Stalingrad 1942-43, where the Red Army surrounded and destroyed a German army. This was followed by the huge tank battle at Kursk in 1943 and the Year of 10 Victories in 1944, which drove Germany out of the USSR and into Eastern Europe. Finally, in May 1945, the Red Army captured Berlin, ending the war in Europe, though at the cost of catastrophic destruction across western USSR. During the war, Stalin also worked with Roosevelt and Churchill at the wartime conferences. Tehran 1943, Stalin secured promises of a second front in France and gained recognition of Soviet claims in Poland. Yalta 1945, Allies agreed on Germany's division, UN creation, and confirmed Soviet control of Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. Potsdam 1945, with Truman and Attlee replacing Roosevelt and Churchill, tensions rose. Stalin pressed his advantage in Eastern Europe, while Truman revealed the US had atomic bombs, beginning mistrust that would lead to the Cold War. By 1945, the Red Army controlled nearly all of Eastern Europe. Although new elections were held in these countries, they were not truly democratic. Stalin ensured that only communist-friendly parties could win, often using the single-list voting method, as seen in Yugoslavia 1945 and Albania 1945. Soviet advisors helped communist parties in other countries organize similar elections, so that by 1949 all Eastern European states were under communist rule. Stalin honored his wartime commitments by declaring war on Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria and Korea, coinciding with the American bombing of Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after, ending the war in the Far East. The Western USSR was devastated, 20 million lives lost, around a tenth of the population. 70,000 villages and 98,000 farms destroyed, 4.7 million homes demolished. Railways, bridges, factories, dams, and mines were wrecked. The end of Lend-Lease aid from the USA added to the challenge. To rebuild, Stalin launched the Fourth Five-Year Plan 1946, emphasizing heavy industry and transport over consumer goods. Eastern Europe and Manchuria were stripped of machinery, raw materials, and skilled workers to meet targets. By 1950, many industrial targets were met or exceeded. Soviet citizens were isolated from the West to prevent comparisons and encourage patriotism. Stalin also glorified Russian achievements, claiming many inventions, like the wheel, radio, and printing press, as Russian contributions. By 1948 to 1949, communist governments controlled nearly all of Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia 1948, Clement Gotwal took power, opposition was eliminated. Poland 1947, communists banned the largest opposition party. Bulgaria 1946 to 1947, opposition peasant party banned. Hungary, Matyas Rákosi used salami tactics to remove opposition gradually. Winston Churchill famously described this division as an iron curtain descending across Europe. To consolidate control, Cominform 1947, coordinated communist policies in Eastern Europe. Comecon 1949, coordinated economic policies among the Soviet blocs. Fortified borders with fences, minefields, and sentries cut off Eastern and Western Europe almost completely. After World War II, Stalin ruled the USSR as an absolute dictator, even more than before. Between 1947 and 1952, the Politburo and Central Committee did not meet, leaving Stalin to make all decisions himself. Orders were often given verbally to whoever was nearby, and anyone ignoring them risked arrest or execution. Alexander Solzhenitsyn described Stalin's late-night deliberations, which included introducing prison for absenteeism, extending working hours, and enforcing forced labor, abolishing the Third International, deporting entire populations to Siberia. Mistakes were fatal. Solzhenitsyn wrote that Stalin never accused directly. A glance or expression was enough to sentence someone to death immediately. During his final years, Stalin increasingly targeted Jews. 1948, Jewish intellectuals were purged, accused of anti-Russian conspiracies. Jewish theaters, newspapers, and magazines were banned. By 1952, Stalin was seeing conspiracies everywhere, according to Nikita Khrushchev. His daughter, Svetlana, attributed this paranoia to age and loneliness, describing Stalin as trapped in a vacuum, isolated and lacking any human companionship. Most Soviet citizens experienced Stalin through propaganda, which glorified him as the genius leader and strategist of the party and state. A figure whose thought could guide citizens through difficulties, inspire confidence, and help make correct decisions. By 1952, Stalin was completely isolated and increasingly detached from reality. In January 1953, he planned another purge, targeting 9 Jewish doctors in the Kremlin. Before the arrest could occur, Stalin suffered a stroke and died on March 5, 1953. His body was displayed in the Kremlin, drawing hundreds of thousands of mourners. The poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko described the chaotic crowd scene at the funeral. People were pressed together in a suffocating mass. Young, short individuals were crushed or smothered. Yevtushenko experienced horror and rage, realizing the cost of Stalin's rule, even in death.